Hello, welcome to Château de Messilhac, on the borders of two historic regions, Haute-Auvergne and Rouergue, and more specifically in the Carladès region. Messilhac, as you're about to discover, is a unique vestige of the French Renaissance architecture in the Cantal, and it's a monument that has remained virtually unchanged since the 16th century. So here we are in a totally unspoilt environment. You don't hear any noise, you don't have any noise pollution. We're in the middle of a green circus which gives Messilhac all its charm. We are indeed far from the rest of the world. So what you're about to see today is first and foremost a historic chateau, very authentic, which has remained virtually unchanged since the 16th century, which is unique in the richness of its architecture on the facade, as well as by the transformations inside the chateau. That's why Messilhac has twice been the setting for two films, the last and best known being La Princesse de Montpensier, one of Bertrand Tavernier's last films before he leaves us. Messilhac was acquired by myself in 1998, and interestingly, the chateau has remained in the same family since its origins in the middle of the 13th century until its first sale in 1942 to third-party buyers, and I bought it myself from the owner's descendant in 1998. And so, for the past 25 years, I have been maintaining and restoring Messilhac as far as possible to enable to this residence to pass through the centuries as it has done for the past 8 centuries. So Messilhac was built on a rocky plateau, and originally you had this first keep called a seigneurial tower, which rose to the height of the 3rd floor. And this keep, where the Lord lived, was surrounded by a wall which rose to about the height of the 1st floor and was equipped with 5 or 6 towers, of which only 2 remain today. The entrance tower here clearly dates from the 13th century, and another tower behind. The last 3 or 4 towers have been demolished over the years. The same goes for the perimeter wall, since, as you can see, only traces of the original perimeter wall remain, and the stones were reused. The construction of a terrace extension in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So starting with this first keep, we have proof that the second keep, which looks just like it, so much so that they can be considered twin towers, have been probably built in the 15th century. And in the 16th centuries, the two keeps have been reunited by arranging the central body in order to give a coherence and unity to that castle. And so the result is that today, this chateau stands with a relatively classic plan, as you can see, with two keeps and a central body, but it's the result of a number of historical developments. And you will see that when Messillac's grand central staircase was built, the owner took the opportunity to remove all slag from the old Messilhac structure to create a chateau that's extremely easy to live in, and on which I think the Messilhac family lived very happy days, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, because it really was a home, albeit a country one, very comfortable for that time, and a great deal of pleasure given Messillac's setting. So Messillac's most emblematic feature, the one for which Messilhac is best known, is the quality of this facade. So I won't go into all the details, but you can see that this facade is clearly from the Renaissance period. It is even dated 1531, and all these transformations were carried out by the owner at the time named Jean de Montamat, who left his initials engraved on the facade as well as the bust you see in the middle of the scallop shell, symbol of the Compostelle pilgrimage. His bust is surrounded by the motto "In Domino Confido," which was the motto of the next owner in the family that was the de Rastignac family. And so this beautiful facade, which has not yet been completed, and you'll see later inside the chateau that the exterior gives every appearance of a finished job. Inside the castle, however, you'll see that from the second floor onwards, I'd say the main thing remains to be done, and that the next Messilhac owners will still be able to continue the work begun in the early 16th century by Jean de Montamat. And so this facade and this door with this carved is very beautiful with a lot of finesse. And we think that these works, which are very refined, were made by craftsmen and Italian artists who came after the campaign of Francois I in Italy to work at first for the archbishop named Conte de Rodez, and have then moved northwards and stopped in Messilhac and probably spent some time building this beautiful carved facade with all these motifs that are, it has to be said, relatively well preserved today. So when I tell you that it's not finished yet, if you imagine a Renaissance castle as seen here, or other stones in the Loire Valley, you'd say that this facade should have ended with a pediment, and indeed you will see later in the framework that the pediment was already planned. And here too, it's a new evidence of the fact the owner was unable to complete the work. Nonetheless, it has left us with a facade that faces due south, which in summer is extremely cheerful. The sun, thanks to the large windows that were opened in the early 16th century. And as you can see, these are mullioned windows. The sun is shining very brightly. Inside the chateau, which made life at Messilhac extremely pleasant, especially in the summer months, when the house was bathed in sunshine. And as you'll see inside, circulation inside Messilhac was very easy, since we built this grand staircase. And we also have some very large rooms, not very numerous, but sufficient to allow the Messilhac family to live in very comfortable conditions for that time. I now propose to continue your visit inside Messilhac by passing under this beautiful arched door. Then you'll notice above this door that there are still coat of arms, even if they are a little damaged. These are not, of course, the original ones, since they are in fact arms of the de France family, crossed out in red, since in fact these are the coat of arms of the Prince de Montpensier, and it's a rest of decoration which had been set up for the shooting of Bertrand Tavernier's film, since Messilhac was supposed to be the home of the Prince de Montpensier. You'll see that there are 2 or 3 remnants of these coat of arms, who was a cousin of the king's by the left leg, which explains the red stripes on the coat of arms, since he was an illegitimate child. So let's go inside, where you can't fail to see this magnificent and grandiose Italian staircase, which was built at the same time than the rest of the restructuration of the castle. So, as you can see here again, this is a highly refined piece of work. The staircase finally is held by this central pillar, on which some very fine sculptures remain. This is a beautiful frieze. You do have this ridged column, and on marquees on both sides, which take over bow effort and also above the door. And so the ceiling is ribbed, which are still in very good condition, and which unfortunately were damaged during the revolution. Since you see that all the decorations which were clipped into these warheads, whether coat of arms, whether bunches of grapes, any type of decoration we had at the time was probably hammered out during the French Revolution. Fortunately, this is the only damage that the revolution brought to Messilhac, which has unfortunately not been rectified. What's interesting is that this staircase, as you see it, rises to the left. In other words, it's a staircase that leaves indeed a very large space to evolve for the person climbing the stairs, which clearly showed that we were out of the war period, since staircases designed for wartime favor those who defend themselves. In this case, the staircase rises to the right, whereas here we have a staircase going up to the left, which means that the warrior who wants to assault Messilhac can do so with his right arm to evolve extremely widely, while the defendant who tries to prevent him from going up is stuck as the staircase moves to the left. It's further proof that these 16th century alterations were truly intended to transform a military chateau into a home for pleasure. So this beautiful stairwell you'll see later, up to the second floor, serves 2 rooms on each floor. Here, for example, the room that is now the family dining room has been for several centuries the lower hall of the castle, and the owner in the early 16th century, Marguerite de Messilhac, made it her living room. It's in this room in which a number of acts found in the archives have been signed, always referring to the chateau's lower hall. And as you can see, even if the paint is a little faded now, the ceiling was completely painted, and you have the repetition of a certain number of motifs, and in particular the crossed S, which was the signature of Marguerite de Messilhac, the owner of Messilhac, during the house's heyday, which was in fact the second half of the 16th century. So this room is now a very pleasant one, since imagine that during the 16th century renovations, the loopholes on the main facade were removed to replace them with large windows, which means that today the room is extremely bright and sunny if the sun wants to show up. To the right of the staircase is the room that was once the heart of the Messilhac house during its history, which is the old kitchen. So, as you can see, this kitchen is very much in keeping with traditional kitchens of Cantal, with that big fireplace that we call a cantu in our region, or an inglenook, with the 2 small benches inside the chimney, for older people in particular, to keep warm and monitor meal preparation, which of course were done over a fire. So this room that is no longer used as a kitchen allowed at the time domestic staff, family, etc. to work together to share a large part of the day when preparing and serving meals, who were certainly taken by all these people around this traditional table of the region, which also has, I'd say, a very special detail. I'm talking about this drawer you have here, used to seat young children. And so we didn't store the bread inside, but sat the children down, which avoided the need for high chairs, which were not yet available. And the children took part in the meals sitting in this drawer. There's an element of modernization in this kitchen, probably in the 17th century. It was the ancestor of the timer. Here you have a clockwork system, quite similar to that of a pendulum which was driven by a weight. And the weight was in that closet. And therefore, when it comes to cooking, the weight was lifted. Then you had a string to turn the spindle. And once the weight was down, this meant that the cooking time had been reached and meat, or the animals that were cooking in the fire, were cooked. For the rest, in this room, you have the traditional layout of the kitchens in the region, including a number of ceiling hooks, which were used to dry cold meats, to dry vegetables and herbs, but also to hang instruments for cooking. Good. After this tour of the ground floor, I suggest we move up to the first floor, where you'll find a similar layout. After the 16th century seigneurial room, you'll see the 17th century seigneurial room, which has gradually been transformed into a living room with, here again, the evolution of the house and the lifestyle of its inhabitants. So this beautiful staircase with extremely wide steps is worn by time, and all the more so that we can imagine that some people didn't hesitate to take their horses up the stairs. This motto, "Virtue as a Guide," which is thought to have been the motto of Captain Raymond Chateau de Rastignac, who was the third husband of the owner of Messilhac, who was, at the end of the 16th century, the Lieutenant General of Haute-Auvergne, who was the leader of the High Royalist Party, which contributed to Messillac's rise not only in economic terms, but also in political terms and in terms of influence in the region until the end of the 16th century. And that's why you'll see later in the Queen's bedroom that we remember the visits that Queen Margot made to Messilhac, since, in a way, Messilhac dominated the whole region, and therefore lords and visitors used to come and pay their respects to the Lady de Messilhac and her husband, who at the time was Captain de Rastignac, which helped rid this region of Cantal Protestants, since he succeeded in driving them out of Mur de Barrez and Aurillac by laying siege to these two cities. As you turn right, you'll notice this door, now closed, which was the old entrance to the chateau. Before this transformation in the 16th century, the chateau entrance and staircase were outside an adjacent tower. And so, among the transformations, there has been a change in levels, and above all, the replacement of this stair tower by this great staircase we now have. I now invite you to discover the large 17th century seigneurial room in which stood the Lord of Messilhac, in which, of course, his meals were brought, enjoyed the comfort provided by this large stone fireplace, which is decorated with a 17th century painting, a rather classical style without any particular representation. And so this large room was gradually transformed into a large living room, as you can see. So the floor remains as it was then. That's to say, a terracotta floor and terracotta floor tiles on a bed of sand, which provides very good insulation indeed, both thermal and acoustic, which allowed the lords to receive a certain number of people in this large seigneurial room, which was also the heart of life in Messilhac from the 17th century onwards. Now, an interesting thing in order to finish on this part of the floor is going to have a look on the original room, which is the first floor of the former dungeon. So the first floor of the 13th century seigneurial tower, and who was at that time the seigneurial room. As you can see, due to the thickness of the dungeon walls, approaching 3 meters, we have a small room in which the Lord stood, which allowed him to, thanks to an external entrance on the second floor, to be relatively protected. And with interior wooden staircases, probably improved scales, there was communication with the upper floor where his family lived and the top floor, which was where the soldiers were positioned, who helped keep watch over the Goul Valley. So, as you can see, the walls are extremely peaceful, and it really is a very old room that wasn't even vaulted with a flat ceiling. And at the time, you were also probably in the center of the room. A trapdoor leading to the ground floor room, traditionally found in feudal towers, served as a reserve, and in which food and weapons were stored, well protected from outside intrusions, and of course pests as far as food is concerned. So after this historical part, since you will have seen 3 seigneurial rooms from the 13th, 16th and 17th centuries, I would now like to take you a little further into the 20th and 21st centuries with a small lounge which is not usually open to visitors and on which current family life focuses when you can't enjoy the terrace. And in it I've put together a number of paintings that have been made to represent Messilhac, either some historical paintings or slightly more recent paintings which can be orders spent with regional, which are interesting since everyone was able to interpret painters his vision of Messilhac. We all have in mind the traditional vision of the beautiful facade as seen from the front on some of the paintings, but there are more original approaches with either skew or bottom-up approaches, or with very special angles of view, like this one made by a great Marseille marine painter who came to Messilhac and told us how he saw Messilhac when he arrived. Or this one by a regional painter from Aveyron, who found it interesting to show Messillac's never-seen north facade on which there are no openings, but it's a bit of a counterweight to the south facade you see today, which in turn is extremely cheerful, south-facing with lots of windows. On the other hand, it's a bit like the other side of Messilhac, with its closed northern facade, which we don't enter. And so it was interesting for him to also present this northern facade and not focus solely on the south facade as some do. So we're going to continue up this beautiful staircase. You'll notice that the first floor is completely comparable to the ground floor. What's interesting is that the motifs are completely different. They remain as refined and varied as ever. But clearly the sculptor was given carte blanche, so each floor has a different set, which contributes to the originality of this staircase. So the staircase continues. You'll also notice that the steps are less worn, which shows that, as much as the first floor kept a somewhat public character, because that's where the Lord received its entire court. While on the second floor, we're clearly in more private apartments in which a number of rooms were located. And now we'll take a look at the Queen's Room, a well-known Messilhac feature. And it's in that room there, according to oral tradition, Queen Margot spent a number of stays in Messilhac when she came to visit the Lady of Messilhac in 1585 and 1586. So now we enter the home of Queen Margot. As you no doubt know, Reine Margot was Reine Marguerite, the wife of Henri IV, the first wife of Henri, who was no longer on good terms with her husband in the late 1580. She ran away from the court of Nérec in 1585 and she took refuge in the fortress of Carlat, which is about 10 kilometers from Messilhac, which belonged to his mother, Catherine de Médicis, and so she came to seek shelter. And as I told you, Messilhac was the seat of the Lieutenant General, for Haute-Auvergne was the seat of the leader of the Royalist Party. It was normal that Queen Margot came to spend several days in Messilhac, where she occupied, which is also perfectly normal, the most beautiful room in the castle, which is this great room, just above the main hall, which is also very comfortable, with a beautifully carved fireplace. You'll see decorations that clearly date back to the Renaissance. You can see a painting on the mantelpiece on the chimney, and the specialists hesitated for a long time to find out who was represented on this medallion in the middle of the mantelpiece. In fact, it appears that it was the woman who married Shep de Rastignac's son, named Marie de Brezon, who was apparently endowed with a large fortune, which saved the family from serious financial difficulties. And maybe it's in thanks that his medallion was reproduced on the mantelpiece of the most beautiful room in the castle. So this room, which is also a very comfortable room, also benefited from improvements by Bertrand Tavernier's movie, since unfortunately the murals you see here are dated from 2010 and not the 16th century. But they look great in this room, and that's why, in memory of Bertrand Tavernier and the Princesse de Montpensier, we decided to keep them. Before continuing the tour to the third and fourth floors, I think it's worth stopping here for a moment on the second floor landing. If you look up, you'll see that you have the same organization as on the previous floors concerning the ceiling of this staircase. But as you can clearly see, the work obviously hasn't been done, so we don't have the center column. Here we have the four capitals as on the ground and first floors. We have the marquise above the window, but the staircase, and consequently the finishing work from the early 16th century, was never completed. We don't know why, but we think it was probably for financial reasons that owner Jean de Montemar was unable to complete his project. And so what's interesting is that from the early 16th century to the present day, from this floor, Messillac's entire interior is made of wood, which clearly shows that in his mind it was a temporary setup pending completion of the final works, mainly in cut stone, that this work was never carried out. And so today, from this second floor to reach the attic, under the roof of the central section, we have to use this wooden staircase, and you will see that everything has been prepared above to complete the work as Jean de Montemar had imagined it, but nobody came to replace provisional elements with definitive ones. And so what you're going to see now is temporary construction dating from the early 16th century. So let's take the wooden staircase. Before continuing our visit to the upper floors, you noticed earlier on the facade that above the beautiful Renaissance decorations remained the corbels that supported the old guard's walkway. Obviously, if the work had been completed, the corbels would have been replaced by the pursuit of these sculptures to a pediment built inside the roof. To give you an idea of what this walkway actually looked like, we are fortunate to have a north-facing building of a remnant of the chemin de ronde, which I suggest you take a look at through this maid's room, which we have reconstructed to show what living conditions were like in Messilhac personnel in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so by opening this door, you come to the remains of the old parapet walk, which was used to watch over and defend the castle on its northern facade. And as you can see, the corbels are on the ground, on which were placed simple wooden planks, which could be used to throw stones in the event of an assault on the castle, and you have protection in the form of essentially of stone mixed with earth, and certainly a bit of straw, so relatively rustic. The objective was clearly defensive, which provided protection against stone throwing, but mostly arrows, and in return to throw stones at the attackers if they wanted to enter from the north. Imagine that this type of layout existed on the south facade and that it was totally incoherent at the time of the Renaissance, when we wanted to create a Renaissance palace or castle to preserve the remains of a medieval period which was now a thing of the past. Nonetheless, the family has kept, fortunately for us and for our understanding of the building and its history, this remnant of the covered walkway on the north side, which is the rather poor facade I was talking about earlier, and which didn't benefit from all the transformations from the 16th century onwards. So if we continue our tour of the temporary building, you can clearly see that from this very first room, which precedes the dovecote we're about to enter, the entire building is made of wood. You can see that the beams have not been placed between the walls, and that we've done some temporary construction on which a wooden superstructure has been placed in order to be able to use this space and these rooms pending completion of the work. So one of the historic rooms we still have on this floor, it's the Messilhac dovecote, which has the particularity of having been built inside the castle in the East Keep and not, as is often the case, outdoors. And so, as you can imagine, this dovecote was built in the 16th century, probably by the owners Château de Rastignac and Marguerite de Sognac. It was, I'd say, the completion of the status Messilhac had achieved by the end of the 16th century. And it was obviously important for lords to have a dovecote, especially at a time when Messilhac ruled the entire region. And so this room was built by removing the floor between the third and fourth floors to make a large room in which the bowls that are these earthen vases were sealed inside the walls. To give you an order of magnitude, we estimate that each of the bolts, which contained a pair of pigeons, represented about 1 hectare of land. So we deduce that Messillac's assets at its peak at the end of the 16th century was around 300 hectares, which is enormous for the region and, according to historians, allowed Messilhac to dominate 24 parishes and also a number of vassal castles which depended on Messilhac. And it was absolutely normal that the owner, the Lord of Messilhac, had a dovecote at such a time to show the influence he had on the Carlades region. And so, in addition to removing the floor, this room has been fitted out with a large opening, since it's obvious that the original murder hall was unsuitable for pigeon entry and exit. And so we made a grand opening with a slab of schist on the outside for both so that the pigeons can take flight and land, but also to protect the dovecote against rodent intrusion. Because it's clear that with a horizontal plate, rodents can't, even if they climb all the way up the facade, cannot enter the loft. And inside the loft you always have this revolving ladder since the 16th century, which allowed access to each of the boulins and take either the eggs that had been laid or pick up the droppings, which, as you know, was used as fertilizer at the time. I'm not sure we've used much pigeons as a means of communication, which, as you know, was used as fertilizer at the time, but I think they were certainly used in the kitchen, both meat and eggs. In the same way as droppings, since the floor is very clean now, the meat was used to fatten the land for cultivation. So, as you can see, I took here again a wooden staircase to reach this last level, this large room which lies exactly between the two keeps. And as you can see, two chimneys had already been planned at each end. It was therefore obvious that this room should have been fitted out like the first or second level, with one large and one medium-sized room, each with a fireplace, with beautiful openings, because, as you can see, this frame, which dates from the 16th century, is extremely well preserved because it's a chestnut frame. There are no cobwebs, there are no pests, there are no insects, since chestnut has repellent properties. This framework planned on the south side of the building the opening of a large window, which would have ended here the facade's design in the early 16th century. And on the north side we would have cut two windows that today we would call seated dogs, to bring light into each of the two rooms that should have been built here. Today the floor is made of wooden planks, and this confirms the obvious that the work I described earlier has not yet been completed. You can imagine what Messilhac would have been like if all this could have been achieved according to Jean de Montamar's plans. In other words, we would have had 2 or 4 beautiful reception rooms again, with excellent southern exposure and with beautiful openings in Renaissance style. Unfortunately, this was not achieved. And today we can at least enjoy the privilege to have this great room, which was used in one of the 2 films as the Musketeers' dormitory. So I'll leave it to you to imagine this room converted into a dormitory. This was not his original vocation, but in the end, it was to a temporary job during the shooting of Young Blades, the first film shot in Messilhac in the year 2000. Well, I hope you enjoyed this quick visit to Messilhac, and that I could have given you a bit of the passion I have for this monument, which I acquired 25 years ago. What is very interesting in Messilhac is the authenticity of the place. We sense that it's steeped in history and that it hasn't been disturbed beyond the 16th century. Which is also important is that it gives visitors a particular idea of a certain type of castle. In France, we know the great 18th century castles that more or less inspired Versailles. We're all familiar with fortified castles, and on the other hand, a small rural chateau like Messilhac is little known. And what's interesting is that, well, we're in an extremely remote region, and imagine how remote this region was in the 16th century. We were nevertheless able to benefit from the quality of the work made by craftsmen and artists who have considerably embellished this country house. And so it's a small castle, but it's a small castle in terms of size. It's a small castle that no longer has any influence on the region, as can still be seen in large castle open to the public. But it still shines today by the quality of the work over the centuries by successive Messilhac owners. And I, in turn, am working to preserve and pass on this heritage to those who will succeed me. Thank you.